So, are you familiar with the theories of embodied cognition and like George Lakoff and his metaphor theory of thought, basically?
Sure.
I think what you're saying is the same thing, right? We have these categories that emerge from our lived experience as humans in our human environment.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
And because these are actually the only tools we have, we use them in recombination with each other, with themselves, if necessary, in modification. But we use them as ways of making sense of the world. Even our scientific models are predicated on the embodied experiences we have.
Well, that's a tougher one. That's a tougher one, because I do think that that science does have there's a qualitative difference. It is in some sense stepping outside of the mythological framework, and it's because it's this really powerful technique. It's like, okay, what is the nature of our shared experience? Now, that's not exactly what science is about. It's more like, if we behave in such and such a way, something will happen. We're going to interpret that from a subjective perspective, like a personal perspective, let's say. But what happens if we get 100 people to do that, and they all observe the outcome, and then they all tell a story about it, and then we take what's common across the stories? It's like, oh, well, that's interesting. We get a new way of describing things. Well, is that true? Well, then you get back into the problem of what constitutes truth. Is it useful? That we also don't know that, because we don't have the time frame across which to analyze it yet. Like, we're staking our survival on the presupposition that it's useful. But it's like, there wouldn't be constant bouts of apocalyptic thinking if we didn't have our doubts about it, right? And it's certainly an anomaly in the natural world. Well, no other creature has science. It's like they did perfectly well without it. Maybe science is fatal. I mean, it could easily be fatal. So, and someone who's a scientist in the sort of ideological sense would say, well, even if it's fatal, it was still true. It's like, well, it depends on how you define truth. Like, if you're willing to say that fatal is true, well, then go ahead. But I think that's not a good definition of truth. And that's where our disagreement really lies. You have your definition, and I have my definition. I think my definition is Darwinian. So you have to contend with that if you're a scientist. But you might dispute that, although it's not clear to me how you would dispute that. But, well, we've already run through that argument. It gets tangled up at the bottom, And I also think, well, part of the problem with the view that only what is objectively observable is real, which you can have a science without that presupposition. You could say only what is objectively true is uniquely useful and valuable. But it's part of a bunch of things that are uniquely useful and valuable. But let's not discount it. It's also dangerous, so we got to keep an eye on it, It's a big tool. Well, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. What do you take the next step and you say, only that? Well, then I also think another way. It's like, why are you claiming only that? You say, well, it's because I'm pursuing truth. And I think, oh, you're sure about that, are you? You actually think that, like, you're sure that you're on this pristine path. And all those other people who aren't, they're deluded, or there's something wrong with them. But you're on this pristine path. You're so sure of that. I don't think you know anything about yourself if you think that. It's like, all scientists are devoted to the truth. What truth? Like, maybe they're devoted to the purpose of demonstrating that there's no meaning in life so that they don't have to bear any moral responsibility. It's like, why not that? Oh, well, we wouldn't think that. It's like, well, I'm a psychoanalyst. I might think that. Because whenever anybody says to me, I believe X, I think, what does it allow you not to believe? I'm for X. What are you against? Well, I've thought about this a lot. It's like, oh, it's a catastrophe that the war between science and religion blows our capacity to believe in transcendent meaning. It demolishes our ability to believe in transcendent meaning. Isn't that a catastrophe? Sort of the Nietzschean viewpoint. It's like, I don't know if it's a catastrophe. Because then I think, all right, well, under what conditions would you be motivated to accept that catastrophe? Well, could say your life is meaningful, but meaning comes at a price. The price is basically moral, and part of that moral price is truth and responsibility. You have to bear that. Okay, it's like, yeah, you get meaning, but now you've got some work to do. You don't get to regard your actions as trivial. You don't get to rationalize your errors of speech as casual and forgivable. None of that. You get the whole burden that goes with meaning. Or you can say, well, nothing's meaningful. Well, Dostoevsky figured this out a long time ago. If there's no God, if there's no moral values, everything is permitted. It's like, okay, maybe that's what you want. Maybe your whole argument, even though you don't know it, maybe that whole argument, of which you're only a part of, is actually predicated on the desire to demolish the necessity for truth and responsibility. So, well, you could say no. It's like, okay, but, you know, it's not like science has always been put to purposes that we would regard as ethical. And then you also have to ask, well, what allows us to ask the question of whether or not science is put to ethical purposes? What's the framework for evaluation? Well, it's not scientific. Well, does it exist? Solzhenitsyn said something interesting about the Nuremberg judgment, because he thought of that as like a pinnacle event in the 20th century. And I can understand this, because, like, you know, there's this Cartesian, one of the things Descartes did, hypothetically, was to try to doubt everything till he found something he couldn't doubt. And what he couldn't doubt was the fact that he thinks. Now that's a translation, so I don't really know if he meant I think. Whatever. He had this process of radical doubt. Well, I did that too before I wrote Maps of Meaning, except I didn't know that Descartes had done it. I was trying to think, what do I actually believe? What's unassailably true for me? And I thought, pain. Pain's true. It's really hard. You can't argue yourself out of pain. It's like, when it happens, it's real. No matter what you say about subjectivity, it's like you're running around screaming, so who cares what you say? And then I thought, well, the infliction of pain is real. And then I thought, well, and pain is unpleasant. It's got that quality about it. You know, and so that was good. And then there was another process of argumentation that led me to conclude that what constituted evil was the infliction of unnecessary pain. And for me, like, so not only, like, if I'm really evil, I'm going to inflict pain in a way that not only damages whoever I'm inflicting, it also damages me, and that's fine. It's like the shootings in the high schools. It's like, why don't they just shoot themselves to begin with? Why go to all the trouble? Well, try answering that. You should read some of the writings of the Columbine killers, man. They'll make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. You know, you cannot believe what those kids wrote. It's uncanny what they were thinking, truly. So, well, they're motivated by something. Well, what? Well, it's something satanic from an archetypal perspective. You know, so for me, what ended up at the bottom of reality was it's wrong to inflict unnecessary pain. So pain even that doesn't serve your own purposes even. That's the Nuremberg judgment, fundamentally. It's like, there are things that are wrong. Okay, are you going to accept that or not? Well, if you accept that, there's a place you go. And if you don't accept that, there's another place you go. And we already saw what happened when people go to that place. And so you can say, well, that's irrelevant. Okay, fine. You pay the price for your belief. So will other people. So so that's why Solzhenitsyn is at least in part an admirer of the Nuremberg judgment. It's like, there are things that are archetypally evil. You don't get to escape from them because of culture. You don't get to escape from them because of the particulars of the situation. Well, you can make a strong case that that's victor talk and revenge. Fair enough, but when I wandered through the Holocaust literature and the literature on the Japanese invasion of China and the literature on the Stalinist camps, that was sufficiently convincing for me. It's like, no, not there. That's not the right place to go. Is that a scientific judgment? No.
But from your own logic, if I understand it correctly, you're saying that your judgment is is predicated on your existence as a human in a dominance hierarchy, and that's what makes that judgment of the fact that this sort of behavior is wrong true, because of the biological context almost.
Sure. Sure, it's deep. Yeah, well, it's more than that, because like as an individual, I'm an individual, but as a human, I'm not an individual at all. I'm this unbelievably old thing. I'm like as old as life. I'm really old. Well, there's the me in this, which is this thing that was like coming around in 1962. But there's the deeper reality of this thing that I am. And that's, you could say, well, that's the Jungian self. That's one way of looking at it. And it has its nature. It's the human nature. Not, well, good and evil are human terms. You know, now whether they refer to something transcendent, that's a whole different question. It is not a simple question, because we don't know what role consciousness plays in being. So like the deepest strata of thought that I've encountered makes the case that the most real thing is the eternal battle between good and evil. And I'm prone to believe that. So, well, what exactly that means, that's a different story. It's a complicated idea.
So to the inner materialist in my brain now is saying, but that's a confusion of facts and values. But what I'm assuming that you would say back, and correct me and tell me what you would say back, even as a materialist scientist, you yourself are a human participating in this human drama. You're
right, and and we
what's
would
embedded in what.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. That's right, because that's the question. Objective reality, mythology, one proposition. Mythology, objective reality, another proposition. That's my proposition. It's like, this is way deeper than this. It's incomparably deeper. Now, that doesn't mean this isn't deep. It's deep, but it's sterile. And that's dangerous. And then when you forget which is embedded in which, then you make mistakes. It's like, yeah, well, why not cross Ebola with smallpox? Well, that's a good question. Why not do it? Well, you know, a rationalist would say, well, I'm capable of making that judgment. Okay, well, let's really specify that. What exactly do you mean that you're capable of making that judgment? Because again, with Dawkins and his ilk, you know, they make the claim that they can have their cake and eat it too. So they can have all the benefits of an evolved morality, which is basically a Judeo-Christian morality in the West, and they can say, well, yeah, but we don't have to accept any of the metaphysical presumptions. It's like, says who? Like, yeah, you could be right, but why would you assume that you are? So maybe this is Nietzsche's point, maybe the metaphysical presuppositions are absolutely necessary. So,
and the question then is, as understood by the millennia-old individuals or cultures that gave birth to them, or reinterpreted as pre-conscious symbology? You see what I'm saying?
No, not exactly. You have to specify that more.
Right, because then Dawkins might say, or I'll try not to pick on him. But then the materialist, positivist, rationalist might say, okay, but what does it mean to accept that mythology or to accept the metaphysics? Does it mean that I have to believe that there's this omnipresent, sadistic God who pits nations against each other and orders you to murder your neighboring tribe? Or rather, is it necessary to accept that the metaphysical background or the substrate, if you will, as understood now, as
symbolic
imagery from a culture that had no other means of articulating it? So that, because then they might say, well, sure, I can accept that it had some value in its time and place, but so.
But okay, that's where the problem would start for me. It's still that time and place. You know, you get this idea too that, like, the evolutionary psychologists do this. Well, where we evolved was the African savanna. And, you know, our moral systems are adapted. It's like, why? Why there? Like, why not in the oceans 300 million years ago? You know, like, why is that the preferential place from which our values are derived? The rest of it's just nothing. It's like, I don't understand that. It makes no sense to me at all. Well, you could say that's where we differentiated from chimps. It's like, well, so what? We're not that different from chimps. So, you know, what about the chimps? They have share a lot in common with us. They didn't go through the savannah. It's like, so the idea that these values, say, are shallow, I mean, if you put it in an evolutionary basis and you go back to the African savannah, well, that's something. It's, you know, a few million years anyways. But to me, that's still icing on the cake. It's not deep enough. This is way deeper. Now, the metaphysics. Okay, well, let's talk about the metaphysics. Okay, whose idea of God are you talking about? It's like, is God an old man with a beard? And he lives in the sky? Okay, well, let's take that argument apart a little bit. Okay, first of all, the ancient Jews, they didn't like you to say the name of God. Why? Because they didn't want you to confuse the representation with the phenomena. So whatever was real for them was something beyond words. Okay? The same thing obtains with Taoism. Same idea. Right? Don't make a graven image, because you confuse the damn image with the thing. What's the thing? It's that which is beyond imaging. Does that which is beyond imaging exist? Obviously. What's its nature? Well, that's a different question. Now, in the Old Testament, its nature is arbitrary, man. It's like, look the hell out. You're going to get swatted down. But if you look carefully at the structure of the Old Testament, and Northrop Frye did this, Frye's argument was basically this. Well, you've got the really old stories. Forget about them. History starts basically with Abraham. What is the Old Testament about? The Israelites climb up to dominance. They get corrupt. They forget about the widows and the children. A prophet comes up and says, you better look out. You're off the path. They ignore him. Whap! They're in chaos for like a long time. They get all humble and they build themselves up again. And when they get power, they get all corrupt. And a prophet comes along and says, you better look out. You're off the path. You're not paying attention to the widows and the children. And all hell's going to break loose. Like, bang, down they go. 6 times. 6 times. So, you know, is that arbitrary? Or is that actually the right idea to derive from history? It's like power corrupts. So you make your kingdom, you make your empire, and it's serving its proper purpose. But you let it get corrupt, things are going to fall apart. So I can give you an example of that. It's like, what caused the flooding in New Orleans? Hurricane. No. No. Corruption. If the dikes would have been built properly, as everyone knew they should have been built, if all those millions of dollars had gone into the pockets of corrupt politicians, there wouldn't have been any flood. In Holland, they built the dikes for the worst storm in 10,000 years. In New Orleans, they built them for the worst storm in 100 years. Well, everyone knew that was insufficient. So why didn't they do something about it? Well, if you get corrupt enough, God will send a flood. It's like, it's an old story. It's right. It's right. Now, the question is, who is God? Well, I would say the ancient Israelites never said who God was. They just said, look the hell out for him. You deviate from the path, man, you're going to get flattened. The people who wrote that book, first of all, like, it was assembled loosely as a book, right? It's a bunch of books. That's what Bible means. It was edited and assembled across vast stretches of time. We have no idea what process led people to assemble it that way, except that they felt that that made sense. You know, so they were guided by their internal intuition of meaning. Weirdly enough, it produced a document with a narrative. Now, the narrative is difficult in some ways to discern, given all the detail. You know, so I would say, give our ancestors a break, for God's sake. What do you want? You want absolute, perfect coherence when they're trying to be so inclusive? Like, it's very hard to be coherent when you're trying to be inclusive. Those two things battle. So, you know, have a little respect. That's how it looks to me. Those people weren't stupid. They were seriously not stupid. And what they thought was not stupid. Now, we can look at it in other ways. Why is God in the sky? Well, I know you can't see it in the city. What's the fastest way to see infinity? I'll look up at the night sky. It's like, why is God up there? Because when you look at the night sky, that's how you feel. So is that wrong? Well, it's not bad. You know, it's like, well, where's the infinite? Because that's really the question. Well, it seems to be up there. It's like, yeah, right. Okay, so you make your sacrifices. It's like, why do people do that? God, that's primitive. It's like, no. The invention of the sacrifice was probably the single greatest stroke of genius that mankind ever was given or produced. What is a sacrifice? You give up something of value now so that things might be better in the future. It's like, that's the human discovery. That's the human discovery of time. Everybody makes sacrifices. It's like, I'm going to go to university instead of partying and, snorting cocaine. It's like, because that's fun. Why? Well, because if I organize my behavior properly and I make the right sacrifices, God will smile on me in the future, or at least the probability seems enhanced. It's like, okay, well, we don't use the same terminology. Well, we use the same terminology. We don't burn rabbits, but then again, we're not agriculturalists. So the people who were playing with the idea of sacrifice, like they were acting out the discovery of time. You can give up something now. Try to get a bone from a dog and tell him you're going to give him 2 bones. It's like, he doesn't give a damn about that. Bone now. And we regard the civilized person as the person who's capable of deferring gratification. Deferring gratification is a sacrifice. Does it please God? Well, everyone thinks so, or they wouldn't do it. So, you burn the sacrifice. Why? Well, God's in heaven. How else is he going to figure out the quality of your sacrifice? Well, you might say, well, that's primitive. It's like, don't be so sure. It's like they got the sacrifice idea right. They got the awe part right. Like they're acting it out. It's concretized. It's like a drama. Does that make it primitive? Well, no, it's not primitive. It's unbelievably sophisticated. It's ridiculously sophisticated. Because the mode in the Old Testament is you make the right sacrifices and you will thrive. It's like, do we believe that? Yeah, it's the basis of civilized behavior. You don't get a complex civilization without that presupposition.
So I think we've actually done quite well.
Good, good. It's hard to keep to a linear track, eh?
Exactly.
This is another problem with this kind of material. It's like Jung called that the process of coming to terms with this material a circumambulation, a continual wandering around a center, and you sort of specify the center by almost by inference. So it's one of the things that make Jung very difficult to read, because everything that he says is dependent on all the other things he said. That's one of the problems I ran into when I was writing Maps of Meaning too. It's like there's a presupposition at the bottom that you have to accept in order to follow the logic, and the presupposition is there are alternative ways of laying out your initial presuppositions about the nature of reality. It's like, well, why should I accept that? Well, I can't show you why till you accept it, because I can't walk you through the argument. It's a paradigm problem, fundamentally. So the way I did that in Maps of Meaning was that it was kind of like a small circle to begin with, and then a bigger circle, and then a bigger circle, and so I could get all the elements described in a simple way, and then make it a little more complex, and then a little more complex, and that seemed to work to some degree, anyways.
And there's something, I mean, not to be sycophantic, but there's something so compelling about it. I think largely in part because that basic presupposition is not articulated well or even accepted in the sorts of science or social science that we learn in university.
Well, that's partly why it's so shallow. The social science in particular, it's like, man, it's unbelievable. That's like, I should be careful about that. I learned a lot from animal experimentalists, a lot, and from neuroscientists, but most of the ones working on animals. They learned things, and part of that was a consequence of behaviorism, which was, a very reductionistic method, useful, So it's like, it's not like I dismiss the capacity of science to produce useful information. It's like, but I'm also terrified of it. It's like, there's no reason to be so optimistic about scientific truth. The other thing that I've noticed about the rationalists, or the empiricists, they're sort of off in the same corner, is that they always make the assumption that if we transcend our historical religions, we'll no longer be religious, and what we will be is rational. It's like, I think, no, you're completely out of your cotton-picking mind if you think that. It's like, well, how do you account for the emergence of New Age philosophy? It's like, if you want incoherent, just take a wander through that desert. It's like, you blow out these historically these carefully constructed historical frameworks, what you get is like rampant and insane Protestantism. The idea that people will magically become like Newton because we've blown out the substructure of morality. Like, that's so absurd that that's the sort of thought that I think is motivated. It's like there's a reason to believe that, because who the hell would believe that? It's just, you don't know anything about people if you believe that. People are, it's hard to think scientifically. It's really hard. Here's a way of thinking too. You could think, you can reduce religion to sort of Darwinian principles and sort of destroy it that way, you know, or you can expand your notion of Darwinism so that it actually encompasses the genuine phenomena of religion. Man, that is way more interesting. But the problem is, it's also the reason that people won't read Jung. First, he's very difficult. Second, he is terrifying. It's terrifying to read Jung. So, well, because, I mean, no one thinks like he thought. Nobody thinks like that. I mean, his grasp of the development of ideas stretched over, like I said, 10,000 years. It puts the Enlightenment thinkers to shame. But if you start grappling seriously with the idea that ideas have people instead of people having ideas, that forces you to reevaluate the entire nature of your being. Because the other thing he asked is, which ideas have you? And where are they suggesting that you go? And like that's like the Greek god idea, right? We're playthings of the gods. It's like, well, Dawkins already knows about memes. These are like meta memes. And so let's not be too incautious about who's in control here. So it's like, okay, well, you've developed a nihilistic philosophy that's predicated on rationalism. Fine. Why? Who's behind that precisely? You? It's like, yeah, right. No way. 1,000 other people wouldn't think exactly the same way if it was you. You're just in its grip. And what's it up to? It's up for the betterment of humanity. Sure, maybe. But, you know, I wouldn't bet my life on it. When Jung wrote about alchemy, which, you know, his writings on alchemy are incredibly opaque, but I can give you a bit of an insight into them. You can understand Jung's writings on alchemy if you start from the presupposition that the matter that alchemists were studying wasn't matter, it was information. Now, you know, the relationship between matter and information is very complex, and some people think the substrate of things is information and matter is sort of an emergent property. Whatever, it's complicated. Now, if you're studying information, you can't study it objectively, precisely, because as you study the information, you get informed. That changes you. And so the problem with studying this sort of thing is that you can't study it without being changed. Because if you're not changed by studying it, you're not studying it. It's not, you're no anthropologist who's outside of this. You can't be. Because if you're outside of it, you don't understand it. Because if you understand it, then you're not the same person anymore. So you can't keep it at bay. And so that's also partly why Jung is terrifying. You know, there's this, I read, and I don't remember where, you know, there's the crucifix has Latin letters on the top of it, and it's INRI. It means it's the representation of Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. Hypothetically, that was put on his cross. There's an occult interpretation of that, which is also Latin, which I can't remember, but it means all nature is renewed by fire. And so the crucifixion then is assimilated to the idea of a forest fire. Everything burns down before there's new growth. If you study religion properly, it will demolish your personality. Your personality, like the personality that's you, is like the dead branches on a pine tree. It's like you might be clinging to them because you think, well, I'm all these dead branches. It's like, well, yeah, but first of all, you should let go of them. And second, you should let them burn off. And then you might think, well, I don't want them to burn off because that's me. It's like, yeah, that's true. But it's the false you that you're clinging to. Well, that doesn't mean you want to be burned up in the flames. So to study this material properly is to be burned up in the flames. And there's no escaping that. You're just not in it if that doesn't happen. You don't get it. Like, one of the things I realized when I started studying this was that virtually everything I said was a lie. I would say 99%, and by lie I mean it was manipulative, it was unclear, it was vague, and that was all often motivated, or it was a false attempt to gain dominant status, which is typical of someone who's intellectual. It's like, well, I've got these ideas, I've taken them from places, and now I can use them as, say, status weapons, something like that, which is what people do when they're trying to win an argument, say. It's like, that's all lies. It's like, well, that's rough when it's 99% of what you say. First of all, the first thing you realize is how much you aren't. You're not Nietzsche. You know, you have your experience as your claim to reality, and it's often pretty thin. But the development of authentic speech is worth the price that you have to pay for it. So, but you just can't stay detached from this. This isn't a phenomenon to study. It's like the basis of being.
So on that note, because that's an expression of your experience, really delving in depth into the material. Whereas there are other researchers looking at this from a different angle. I'm not saying it's more or less valid. It's just different, right? And they're looking at this from why, not necessarily why or how does religion come about, where do these ideas come from, and why are they important, so much as once they're there, why do they perpetuate, and why are they successful? Why do religions exist when there seems to be so much that a rationalist would find objectionable or just silly?
Sure. So, yeah, then that begs the question, who's silly? The rationalist assumes that it's not him. It's like, okay, let's have some evidence. Well, we can fly to the moon. Fair enough. That's one form of evidence. How long has this been working? 200 years. Okay. Let's iterate it for 1,000,000 years and see what happens. Right, now, you know, and you can object to that because you can say, well, who knows where the future will lead and so on. But my point is that, well, it's what you assume to be true structures your argument, and you have to assume something to be true because you don't have infinite knowledge. So you make that initial choice. Why? Well, it might be because you're a true truth seeker. Well, I would be careful about making that claim, right? Because you're probably not. So then who are you?
Motivated by something that we're not aware of. Is that
There's no probably about that. Yeah, not only that, you might be motivated by terrible things that you're not aware of. Like truly terrible things. You know, one of the things Jung said about the shadow, which was, for him, that was sort of all those parts of you that weren't very developed and are mad about it because you're like, you know, trying to kill them. And all those sort of storehouse of lies and deception that you've managed and all the things you've left undone and the motivations for doing all that. It's like, that's the shadow. He said, well, the shadow is rooted in hell. And you know, you think, well, that's a nice metaphor. It's like, don't be so sure it's a metaphor. It's not exactly a metaphor. I mean, I can elaborate on that a little bit. If you walk down Bloor Street and you watch, you can see people in hell with no problem. Like, they're not only the people who are completely lost, the homeless, but they're the homeless that you cannot look at. And the reason you can't look at them is because they find your act of mirroring their state of existence intolerable. It will instantly enrage them. And that's because they're in chaos, they're in the underworld, but they're in a particular suburb of the underworld. And that little suburb, that's hell. And you think, well, is it eternal? Depends on what you mean. It's been around a long time. It's been around a long time. And it's really deep. And there's another weird thing about hell, which is if you're in it, no matter how bad it is, there's some stupid thing you can do to make it worse. And that's why it's bottomless. It's not obvious what's a metaphor. You know, does heaven exist? Depends on what you mean. I think people get glimpses of it all the time. Those are the times in your life when the meaning shines through. It's like, that's a place when the meaning shines through, that's a place. Like if you conceptualize things as four-dimensional, this place shifts with time. So we're actually sitting in a multitude of places here. Now and then that place configures itself so that it's as perfect as it can be. You get a glimpse. And then you think, well, what if it could always be like that? It's like, well, what if it could be always like that? You know, so you might say, for example, what would happen if everybody told the truth? We know what happens when people don't. You get the Gulag Archipelago. What's the opposite of that? Well, we don't know. We do know that there's an opposite, though. So people are incautious about their discussions of what constitutes real. They don't even notice their own experience. You've never been to the underworld? It's like you've been there every time things have fallen apart in your life. I tell people that all the time in my lectures. Here's what the underworld means. You've been married for 10 years, you're happily married, you come home, your wife's gone, there's a note that says, I'm leaving with my lover of the last 10 years. It's like, well, you were somewhere before you walked into the house, and now you're somewhere different. Where are you now? Well, you're where you go when the bottom drops out. Where is that? Well, it's in the underworld. It's like you're in the underworld. You're in that chaotic state that exists before order is constructed. You go there all the time.
And the reason people can't see the connection between their experience and these earlier mythological representations is because people are being anachronistic and reinterpreting the mythological representations as if
they're scientific theories.
As if these people were naive scientists.
Yeah.
Really what they were doing is coming up with images to explain things that they couldn't otherwise represent, but were real in terms of their lived experience. Is that
absolutely?
Is that
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Why would we think they were naive scientists? What is a chimp a naive scientist? Like, it's just silly. They weren't naive scientists, whatever they were doing. Well, I think they were naive phenomenologists, but they weren't very naive. They weren't concerned with material reality. They were concerned with the nature of being. It's not, I mean, that's Heidegger's claim, right? He believed that, and I didn't know this until much later. Heidegger believed that philosophy actually lost its way with the Greeks, with Plato, for example, when things became rationalized. Nietzsche thought the same thing in many ways, because he was very interested in the Dionysian, right? Which is more like, well, that's more like lived experience, the Dionysian, you know. That's the chemist who goes out and, you know, maybe he's a punk rocker in his spare time, and he goes out in the evening and listens to a thrash metal band and pounds himself against other people. It's like, and doesn't see any contradiction there. It's like, well, one's rational and the other isn't. That's a contradiction, you know. And well, you find the irrational activity enjoyable. Well, how do you account for that? You don't. You just keep the world separate. It's like, so our ancestors were phenomenologists, and they were accounting for their landscapes. They're the geography of being. It's right. Well, there's an underworld. Well, when do you go there? Well, when things fall apart. It's like, that's where you end up. It's like, everyone gets that. You know, I tell these stories to retirees and all sorts of people. I say, look, you know, there's a place that you go when everything falls apart. It's like, oh, I've been there. Then the question is, well, what do you do when you get there? Because everybody needs to know that. That's another thing that religious stories are trying to tell you. When things fall apart, what do you do? Well, we don't think of when things fall apart as a place. But that's our problem. It's a place. I mean, people live in it. All you have to do is go look on the street. It's like, oh, look, that person's in the underworld. It's like, and that person's in hell. And you can tell, but you won't look. You know, what usually happens in a circumstance like that is there's so much in hell that you'll just walk around them and you won't look at them. Well, why not? You don't want to go there. Yeah,
And
that's
we
right.
have that expression in English.
Yeah.
I don't want to go there.
Right.
So,
right.
So there is, encoded in the way we think, there is this inherent locality or geography.
Yeah. Well, and it is a geography. Like it's a slice of space-time, you know. So, you know, it's also the street, but it's not just the street. It's the being of the street.
It's everything that's afforded by the representation of street in our mind. It has other meanings beyond what we, which is something we didn't touch on at all. Actually, I wish we had. which is as the complexity management theory angle, in the sense that how we compartmentalize reality is not at all a given, right? I mean,
no, you do it on the fly.
Right.
You know, and you do it for pragmatic reasons. You know, and so in some sense what you do is you look for the simplest possible and least energetic way of conceptualizing the current situation so that the next thing you want to do happens. It's something like that. And I like to think about it in terms of resolution, you know, because I think resolution is a really useful idea. Most of our representations of reality are extremely low resolution. Like, we'll rely on a thumbnail. Well, why not? Well, it's good enough, right? It's pragmatic. It's good enough. You know, don't make it any more complex than it has to be. And what you are managing always is complexity, because the thing that the representation you use, which is an image, let's say, is a low resolution representation of the reality behind the image. So, for example, you're sitting there. Okay, well, I can't see your back, so I can't see your family, I can't see your culture, I can't see your education, I can't see the biosphere that you're an embedded part of, I can't see any of your substructures. It's like they're all there. They're just as real as the thing that I see. They're causally implicated in everything that you do. It's like, that's complexity. So, you know, maybe, you know, I'm assuming that you're what we both decided to allow to be possible here, right? Because we're both polite. We're doing this little act that, you know, we both agree on. We've never met, but we're going to run this routine. We're going to play by the rules. But, you know, like, for all I know, you could just turn left right now, you know, and then all of a sudden, all that complexity is like, it's there. That's chaos. It's like, that's a potential too, because maybe I think, well, what we're doing is too mundane. It's boring. I'm caught in it. It's like, I hope you turn left a little bit, because then that's the water of life too, that, you know, that refreshing complexity comes back, but hopefully not too much of it, right? I don't want too much of it. I want a little bite-sized piece of it that'll make me interested and not terrified. So that's complexity. And that's a better way of conceptualizing what the terror management guys are after with regards to the fear of death. You know, so partly I don't think they're very imaginative. There's many worse things than death to be terrified of. Like, insanity is probably one. You know, pain, that's a bad one. Long-term pain, that's a bad one. Well, then there's long-term pointless pain. You know, then there's your long-term pointless pain and that of your family. Like, there's horrors that exceed death by orders of magnitude. So to make that the fundamental fear, I think that's an error. You know, it's like, are people more afraid of dying or having their children die? You know, that's a perfectly reasonable question. So I read Becker. Really read him. Like, I like Becker's book. It's brilliant, but he makes a bunch of mistakes. For one of the things he does, for example, is right in the intro, he says, it's a book that's trying to bring about the psychoanalytic closure of the study of religion. So it's neo-Freudian, smartly neo-Freudian. And he wants to explain religion pretty much completely within the psychoanalytic framework. He does a great job. But in the intro he says, well, you might wonder why in a book that's devoted to the last word in psychoanalytic thinking about religion, I never mention Jung. So then he says a bunch of things about Jung. One of them is, I could never understand a single thing he was talking about when he wrote all his works on alchemy. It's like, oh well, that's a problem, because that's where all the information that your book lacks is. All of it. You missed it. It's like, yeah, you're thinking about the hero myth, for example, as a delusion. And, you know, as a hero project, and as something that's only there to stave off the fear of death. It's like, well, you got a good way into the depths, and way farther than most people get, but you missed the next 300 stories. So, and that's too bad. So, you know, and it's funny because I've also read the social psychology, a fair bit of it, that is associated with terror management. And most of the problem with it is it hasn't moved Becker 1 inch. It's like, yeah, that's what Becker said, so we're proving it. Well, no, not really, because the demonstrations are amenable to multiple interpretations. But Becker, he covered it. I mean, it's a brilliant book. but it's wrong.
So, right. So on that note, this argument is wrong in what way? For people that may not have read Becker, they're not fully aware of the terror management theory.
Well, because he thinks of everything that we do to contend with mortality as a ruse, and I don't think that's right. Because I don't think that it's necessary to be terrified of death. Now, it's not easy not to be, but, it's fate that, as far as Becker's concerned, is that that's what you're going to be terrified of. It's like, well, I don't think that that's right. I think that people don't have to be terrified of death. It's not an easy state to achieve. It's not like I want to die, although I can certainly imagine things that are worse than that, like no problem. So I think, and this is something Solzhenitsyn laid out in the Gulag Archipelago too, I think there are ways of living that are worse than death. That's why people commit suicide. That's their decision. So obviously hell is worse than death, given how I described it earlier. So it isn't death that's the problem, it's complexity that's the problem. Is that things are beyond us. And because of that, they always exceed what our models tell us they're going to do. Or they always transform themselves in some ungainly way so that we don't get what we want. So then the question is, well, how do you best deal with complexity? And the reason I think truth is so useful is because generally it reduces complexity, right? I mean, one of the things that's really useful about trying to say things that you believe to be true is you don't have to remember what you said. It's like, well, what did I say? Well, I don't know, but I was trying to explain things properly. Then you don't have to tear through all your rationalizations and think about what you have to keep track of. Like deceptions, they grow, they're like hydras. So, well, don't do that, okay? Truth, simpler. That's one big advantage. And people can say, well, truth isn't always the answer. Well, there are sometimes you get into a situation that's so awful, you've made so many mistakes that not only would it be very difficult for truth to rescue you, you've already warped your character to such a degree that you couldn't even use it. Well, you've had it. You're off the radar at that point, and nothing short of a miracle would save you.
To what degree do you think that, one, the lessons that you've extrapolated and you've put into words are easily applied across various cultures that you may not have necessarily addressed in your examination of mythology, right? And I'm challenging you a little bit here, but just because it's an interesting topic. For instance, Islam just doesn't feature at all in the work that you've written as I've read, but it's a hugely important religion on a global scale, and even in countries like Canada. And then there's also the question of, with so many people coming with different specific mythologies or embodiments of the universal mythology that we're discussing, this is sort of a unique episode in human history in the sense of just the scale and the rapidity with which people are coming into contact with each other from very different backgrounds. So what do you see as the implications of that, for good or for bad, in a country like Canada?
Okay, you mean the fact that people are coming together?
Coming together, but from those very different cultural places in which maybe there's a universal mythology that envelops all of them, but the values and the particular embodiments of mythology that people have grown up with are often very different, and these can clash. I mean, not a
tribal. They clash tribally,
tribally. I don't mean in the clash of civilizations sort of overblown way, but I'm just saying on a pragmatic level, people are often operating in different psychological space.
Yeah, well, to some degree, the issue there is whether or not you can negotiate, right? Because a society, a multicultural society, in many ways is dependent on negotiation. And here's another sort of axiom. It's like tyranny, slavery, and negotiation. Those are your options. You want to be a tyrant? Fine. You want to be a slave? That's an option. But if you don't want to be either of those, you negotiate. Okay, so how do you negotiate? Well, partly you pay attention. So you listen. And so here's another way to think about it. Just like the totalitarian assumes that what he knows will redeem him. It's sort of the basis of terror management theory in some sense, right? So that what you know protects you and keeps you safe. Okay. And so you want to tighten that up and you want to make it rigorous and you don't want anything to exist outside of it. Okay, so in some ways you worship the Great Father. That's a way of thinking about it. Here's another way of thinking about it. What you don't know will redeem you. Well, why? Well, because you already know what you know. And now then you can ask yourself, well, is that enough? And then the answer to that is, well, what's the quality of your life? If the quality of your life is what you want it to be, really, then what you know is enough. But the probability that your quality of life is what you want it to be is very low, because you're still prone to all sorts of suffering and all sorts of ignorance, and you know, you can face that forthrightly. It's one of the things that didn't happen in the Soviet Union, because everybody said, my quality of life is great, we know everything we need to know, when in reality it was like abysmal, murderous, treacherous, deceitful. It was horrible. But you know, so what that meant was that in the Soviet Union, if you admitted to your own suffering, you were a traitor. Well, that's hell. So you can't even let your suffering be true, right? Not only do you have to suffer, but you can't even admit it. Okay, so back to listening. It's like, well, if you assume that what you don't know is redemptive, then you can listen. You can listen, because you never know. That person might know something that you don't know. And maybe that would be a useful something. You know, and maybe you have something to say that they don't know that would be useful. You know, now there's some presuppositions that go along with that. It's like you have to be willing to meet the other person in the space between cultures. And you have to know how to operate in the space between cultures. And that's part of the hero myth, by the way. If you're a hero of the right form, you know how to operate in the space between cultures. Well, then how do you operate there? Well, I think we know. What makes cultures rich? Trust. What makes trust possible? Honesty. You know, you want natural resources? There's nothing more valuable than trust and honesty. Why is the world poor? Corruption. That's why. All the poor countries, almost all the poor countries, are corrupt. Part of the reason they're poor is because they're corrupt. Now, you know, you might say, well, are the Western countries so uncorrupt? It's like, well, they've got their problems, but generally the answer is they're not corrupt. So eBay is a good example of that. You know, because when eBay first emerged, people thought, you send me junk and I send you a check that bounces. So that's the end of eBay, right? So these third-party, I can't remember what they're called, agents set themselves up so that you could pay them a fraction of the price, and they would get the check and the product, validate them, and ship them off. And, you know, they'd take 10% or whatever. There's a particular name for people who do that, like it's a profession. Anyways, what happened was the average rate of honesty on eBay was so high that that was useless. It's like the default was, I won't screw you. And that was between strangers who had never met, and even more weirdly, were never going to engage in another transaction. So what that meant was that eBay all of a sudden became insanely valuable, because people would trade properly. Now, reputation markers soon evolved. But and I do believe that in the West, the default is, you won't screw me. Now, and that means that I can trust your persona. If the default is, you will screw me, then I'm a barrel of snakes and you're a barrel of snakes, and we will never get anywhere.
Exactly, but this is, I mean, if we talk about the state of the world,
yeah,
most of humanity does not live in the West, where the default assumption is, I can probably trust this person.
Yeah.
What are the lessons to learn from what you're arguing and from what you've extrapolated from your experience for these contexts?
Okay, I mean, I can only speak about that at the most general level, because what to do in any particular circumstance, that's the sort of problem I deal with in my clinical practice all the time. It's like, here's this insanely complicated circumstance. It usually has nothing to do with mental illness. It's just the person is caught in something ridiculously complex. Like, you know, their aunt is sick at home, their husband just lost his job, and they have an illness. It's like, oh my God, it's horrible, you know. Are they mentally ill? No, it's just awful. So how do you weave your way through an awful situation? Well, the particulars matter a lot. And so you have to do strategic analysis, paying attention to the details. But, okay, so that's the particulars. So what's the general case? Well, the general case is, maybe, don't falsify your relationship with being. to the degree that you can manage that. Now, one of the things that I tell my students is, try solving a problem, fixing it. Not trying to solve a problem, but, you know, you're going to fix it. And you can fix it. And it's a problem. And you know it's a problem. Okay, so there's like a precondition here. So let's say there's a bunch of things around you that bug you. And you think, those things bug me. Why? Well, you don't know, but they bug you. And you might think, well, is one of those things that bug me something I could fix? And you might think, well, yeah, and there's another part, which is, not only could I fix it, I would fix it. Because you can think, well, I could fix that, but I won't. You know, if you're being honest, you know you just won't do it. But there's often something that you would fix. Start there. Fix it. Then try again. Try to see if there's something else you can fix. Like, so if you're going to beat the lie, you know, you have to start with what you can do. And you start locally, like right locally. And you can tell it's the right amount of local because it bugs you. You could fix it, and you will fix it. So perfect, that's your problem. That's exactly your problem right there. Fix it. Well, then everything shifts a little bit. Everything around you is just, the balance between chaos and order is a little better, right? Well, the same thing applies to your speech. It's like, okay, I have to lie here because otherwise I'm going to get killed. It's like, okay, well, maybe that's not the place to start. You know, maybe that's just foolhardy. Okay, would I say that you should lie in that situation? I would say, I can't tell because I'm not in the situation and the particulars matter. So I don't know what to say. That situation might be so awful that there's nothing you can do that isn't awful. How about in your own home? How about in relationship to yourself? It's like, how about you start fixing up the little micro lies that you leave lying around everywhere? Then it's going to make you tougher and more formidable. You keep practicing that for like 15 years. You know, and then maybe you'll be able to start to address some of the larger problems. Maybe you'll even start to understand what the larger problems are, because that's a problem with prematurely trying to do too much, right? It's like, well, is that really the problem? And what makes you think you'll make it better rather than worse? You've got to pick the right size problem. So I would say, you know, start with little weights and work yourself up. And that's how you develop competence anyways, right? Like if you're going to figure out how to set things straight, you might as well start where you can set them straight. And you might think, well, that's trivial. It's like, it's not trivial. You might think it's trivial. You have no idea how important it might be that you straighten up your relationship with your wife or your son. You have no idea what that might lead to. I mean, just think of what Stellan's relationship with his father led to. Well, it was awful. You know, there's Stellan. He killed like 60 million people. His father was a brute. So that seems reasonably important. Maybe he shouldn't have been a brute. So you know how horrible things can be if you do things wrong. It's like, well, how good can they be if you do things right? You don't know. Try starting. It's like, see what happens. My experience has been that to the degree that I'm able to speak carefully, and I do speak carefully, and I don't really care about the consequences. It isn't that they don't matter, it's that I'm not speaking to produce a consequence. I'm just trying to say what seems to me to be the case. And that, for me, that's been incredibly, ridiculously practically useful. Insanely useful. Like, it's opened doors that I would have never dreamed of opening. So, and you know, in my professional life, it's produced all sorts of opportunities, and it's been a real aid in my private life too, and in my professional life. It's not like I don't make mistakes. Like, I don't think that I would never think of myself as fundamentally a good person. I think maybe I'm fundamentally a bad person, but because I have dark thoughts, and I'm quite temperamental, and so like. Anyways, I do what I can to deal with all that, and I don't do it perfectly, and I slide backwards, mostly by avoidance. I don't always stay on top of the things I should stay on top of, but to the degree that I've been able to adhere to this mode of being, I can't think of a single thing that's happened that hasn't been, like, in some ways beyond my expectations. So, and it's really fun talking to the students, you know, because it's fun with the lectures, because when I'm talking about the mythological material and I can sort of sort out the stories, I can just see lights going on everywhere. It's like click, you know, you can see, it's like, you can tell when someone has an insight. I think they open their eyes a bit more. You know, maybe that's it, because it's a bit of a surprise, so you can detect it. And it is like light going on. And so, you know, I'll walk someone, say, through this Egyptian story, an audience, and they just go click, 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 click. It's fun. It's really fun. So, and, you know, people seem to respond to it positively, which I've always been completely surprised about. You know, I can't believe that I've been able to lecture about the things that I lecture about without, you know, running mightily afoul of something. You know, because my classes are quite different than the standard psychology class or the standard university class. They're very different. But that, I don't know, so far it seems to be working. So, which is a surprise to me. So that's what I would say to people, is like, select the domain in which you can act. Straighten it up first. And that'll transform things a bit. Like you put your house in order. Then you can start to put your town in order, or maybe your street, or maybe your neighbor. God only knows, you know. Start where you can start. And you might think, well, what's that? Well, it's nothing you can wave a placard in the street about, which is a good thing. That's like praying in public, you know. This is more like praying in private. Fix up what you can fix up and see what happens. And I don't think that there's anything that's more powerful than that.